On my Monday night West Ham Weekly show and the subsequent show that went out on Tuesday morning, the focus was very much based on the story about Ruben Amorim and the fact that he had apparently come to West Ham, or come to London, should I say, on Monday to talk about a potential role at West Ham United as the next head coach. Now, no sooner had both those shows gone out than that rumour seemed to have sort of dissipated. It seems that, by the time the second show went out on Tuesday morning, it was old news. Now, look, I thought, okay, there's an awful lot going on at the moment. So I decided to take a step back this week from doing another show about more managerial targets, just to see how the managerial saga would unfold over the rest of this week. And boy, oh boy, have we had a feast of managerial link after link after link. We seem to be linked with every potential manager that's out there: Mourinho, Amorim, Lopetegui, Fonseca, O'Neill, Potter, McKenna, Tuchel, Hansi Flick, Maurizio Sarri, Marco Silva. Not to mention some completely out there names in the likes of Abel Ferreira and Eusebio Di Francesco. And late last night, on Thursday night, Vincent Kompany was added to this illustrious list of potential future managerial head coach targets that West Ham are going to be going for. It has become a bit of a circus, not too dissimilar to the same old dross that we're exposed to when the player transfer windows are in full swing. As with every transfer window, for example, West Ham United are usually linked to something like 10 times the number of players that we really need, whereas the reality is we're only likely to have any real interest in a handful of the names that are mentioned. However, with the real possibility that David Moyes won't be having his contract extended at the end of this season, the same seems to be happening with potential manager links to us as well. But just how close are we really searching for a new manager? How close are we to searching for or getting a new manager for next season? Or would it surprise anyone if David Moyes was to stay beyond his current contract? You see, for the past 18 months or so, we have had a constant Moyes in, Moyes out cloud hanging over the fans' heads. Whilst fans have actually fallen out over this most toxic of issues, the club, the board, the manager, the coaching staff, the players have all just tried to get on with the job at hand. However, as the season does loom to an end, the debate whether David Moyes should get a new contract or not, or whether we should be getting a new head coach, has gathered momentum. So I guess it comes as no surprise that this plethora of managerial names have been coming out of the woodwork lately. And now, of course, with so many managers offering different styles of management, different styles of coaching techniques, the inevitable is beginning to happen, where the rhetoric is now moving to there being conflict between Tim Steidten and David Sullivan as to what kind of manager is right to take West Ham United forward. It was strongly suggested that Amorim was recommended by Steidten, and that it was he who set up the meeting between Amorim and David Sullivan. Now, if that story is true, Sullivan apparently was concerned with Amorim's lack of Premier League experience, in fact, none. The fact that Amorim is only a new coach, only in the role that he's been doing for the last 5 years or so. And the fact that with that in mind, Sullivan was never going to be prepared to pay the 15 million euros release clause for someone so inexperienced in Sullivan's eyes to come out of his contract with Sporting. So Q, the next so-called strongly linked manager, a completely different type of manager, is Julian Lopetegui, who it is said that David Sullivan fancies as the next manager far more than he did Amorim. Now, I say that David Sullivan fancies. Again, this is all speculation. Let's not forget where a lot of rumors come from. Agents go to journalists and say, oh, there's potential interest in player X or manager Y or whatever. And then that journalist will put it on social media. And before you know, a rumor becomes fact. And then, of course, the fan base get angry when we don't end up signing a player or we don't end up getting a manager that everyone thinks we should be getting. Fan base start saying, why on earth has David Sullivan not paid the 15 million euros to get the next best deal, the next best manager in at West Ham? He clearly doesn't care, etc., etc. So let's not forget, a lot of this stuff that comes out is kind of speculation and rumor rather than real fact. But anyway, between Amorim and Lopetegui, how much of a difference is there between the two managers? Well, of course, the main difference indeed is to how long each coach has been doing their job for. Amorim, like I said, just over 5 years, but it's been impressive in that short period of time, with cup success at Braga, as well as league success and Champions League appearances with Sporting. And he's on the cusp this weekend, Amorim, of winning his second Portuguese league title with Sporting. And he is indeed one of the most sought after young coaches in Europe. And those who have worked alongside him have suggested that it won't be too long before he's working for a big club in one of the big 5 European leagues. He isn't afraid to mix use a mix of youth and experience in his teams, and he gets the right balance to make sure he gets the job done. And of course, he's got an eye for young talent as well, such as Victor Gyökeres, who Amorim bought from Coventry City last summer for now what seems now like a bargain, 20 million euros. So it will come as no surprise that Steidten would want such a young and up-and-coming coach at West Ham. It's the perfect fit for what Steidten's project and plan is meant to be. But what about Lopetegui? Well, we hear that all he wants is a massive salary to bring in his own backroom staff at great expense, and he would want a sizable war chest to bring players to West Ham. And the reason why he left Wolves after such a short stint there was because they couldn't provide him with a transfer budget that he said was needed to strengthen the squad. His coaching tactics, however, have stood the test of time. For those who are concerned that he might only want to buy players instead of using potential talent from academies, might want to think again. For example, Lopetegui did spend time when he was head coach for Spanish youth teams, the 2012 Euro in winning the 2012 Euro Under-19 Championship and the 2013 Euro Under-21 Championship as well. So he will know that there are talented youngsters out there that are very capable of doing a job for the clubs that he would manage. Having said that, his time at Wolves wasn't necessarily that good. It was reported that his demeanor was someone who seemed to be doing Wolves a favour, and that staff would often not communicate well with him and often give him a wide berth and consider him as an old school manager who liked to keep himself to himself. And of course, he wasn't very complimentary about Wolves in the months leading up to when he left as well. He sounds as if he's a manager who's been around the block several times over and is now at the stage in his career where it's either his way or the highway. And that does sound shades of a Spanish version of David Moyes. However, his coaching techniques, as I said, have stood the test of time. He was highly commended for the job he did when he was at Seville, where it culminated in them beating Inter in an entertaining 2020 Europa League final, where Lopetegui actually used a mix of young players and experienced players to do the job. His style of play is adaptable from a preferred 4-3-3 formation, playing with a false number 9, converting to a 5-2-3 formation when under attack. So his game management is probably more adaptable to that of David Moyes. But there are concerns over Lopetegui in terms of concerns in terms of the kind of manager he is to managers that we've had before. And he strikes me a shade of the Manuel Pellegrini. Pellegrini, as we know, was an aging manager who had some level of success at previous clubs. Pellegrini was lured by the big salary that was being offered by David Sullivan, as well as the large amount of money made available to him for transfers. And it is possible that Pellegrini, when he finally came to West Ham United, well, not possible, it's fact that when he finally came to West Ham United, he had seen better days. His best years were behind him. And herein lies, to me, the similarity between Lopetegui and managers that we've had before. But herein lies also the conundrum that West Ham find themselves in. Tim Steidten was brought into the club to provide a new way of doing things, a new platform, this long-term project that we keep hearing about. But despite this, if there is any element of truth in there being conflict between Steidten and Sullivan as to who should be next manager, Sullivan seems to have his head buried in the past. To try and understand Sullivan's preferred manager leading West Ham, you've got to reflect on the type of managers that he brought to West Ham during his time here. As we know, in May 2010, Gianfranco Zola was sacked from West Ham United, and the board at that time, the late David Gold and David Sullivan, appointed Avram Grant. Now, they seem to deem him as some kind of like successful figure because he'd taken Chelsea to the UEFA Champions League final in 2008. The team Grant, however, the team that Grant had at his disposal at West Ham were duly relegated less than a year later, and Grant was subsequently sacked on the day of relegation. David Sullivan admitted afterwards that he'd made an error in employing Grant as manager in the first place. But the appointment of Grant seems at such an early stage in the late David Gold and David Sullivan's tenure, ownership of West Ham, seemed to give an impression of the type of manager that they wanted at the club. I guess they seemed to think that bringing in a manager who had either experience or some level of success was the right way to go. And I guess in hindsight, you say, yeah, that seems quite plausible, quite sensible. But a little bit of research into Grant's moderate success in getting Chelsea to the Champions League final would have shown that he did this more because he inherited a really good squad from Jose Mourinho. Then, in the summer of 2011, after we got relegated, the West Ham owners turned to another experienced manager, Sam Allardyce. I guess his years at Bolton had seen a style of long ball football, but he also seen them qualify. We also saw them qualify for European competition. Despite Allardyce's style of play coming under criticism from West Ham fans, he did guide us back to immediate promotion through the playoffs into the Premier League. And in his first season at West Ham in the Premier League, he got us to a moderate 10th finish in 2013. And because of that, he had his contract extended. In July of the same year, co-chairman David Gold defended Allardyce's style of football and saying, you cannot question the job he's done at West Ham. As we know, Allardyce left the club a couple of years later after his contract was not renewed for a further period. He was informed of the club's decision just a few days before the end of the season. And Allardyce then said that he'd already decided himself that he wasn't going to stay regardless. He said, I didn't want to stay. I suppose you can say it was a mutual thing if they didn't want me to stay either. But with the appointment of Sam Allardyce, there are so many similarities to the tenure of David Moyes. Allardyce came to get West Ham back in the Premier League. Moyes came to ensure that West Ham didn't get relegated. Allardyce's style of football was heavily criticised by West Ham fans because they didn't believe that he was playing the West Ham way, which Allardyce responded to, I still don't quite know what the West Ham way is. He said, I always thought that playing attractive football and winning was the West Ham way. But winning is the priority. We all know that. Secondly, is playing well. When Allardyce was then asked whether he felt underappreciated at West Ham, he replied, I think at times you do. There are times you feel the criticism is a little too harsh when you've taken them from where they started to where they've got to. There was always a big expectation based on what you achieve and can achieve more than that. And there's always been a big expectation at West Ham. Goodness me, that was said back in 2015. Fast forward 9 years, and the same things are being said and the same questions are being asked about our current manager, David Moyes. So after Allardyce, West Ham needed to go a different direction, and they appointed someone who they thought would appease the fan base, and that was, of course, Slaven Bilic in 2015. This seemed to make fans happy for a number of reasons. As a former West Ham player, Bilic was already a favourite. Upon joining, he said, "I remember West Ham as a special club. It's not about the size. There's something special about them. They're a cult club." So he got the ethos of West Ham. He understood what West Ham was all about. But I guess that was quite an astute signing by the board because, they needed the fan base to be back on board, to be behind them. And by bringing someone in like him seemed to be a match made in heaven. But a match that's made in heaven that didn't last very long because after 2 seasons, the wheels started to come off. And when West Ham were threatened with relegation again, Bilic was sacked in November 2017, and the board reverted back to type and went for a safe pair of hands in bringing in David Moyes. We all know Moyes did the job, kept us in the Premier League, but fan protests at the time, I think, drove the agenda for the next manager that the club brought in. And that, of course, was Manuel Pellegrini. A Premier League manager, a Premier League winner, with Man City. But that had shades of West Ham going for a manager who should, on paper, should have been able to take West Ham to the next level. However, for me, the fact that he had won the league, again, was a bit similar to Avram Grant's time at Chelsea. Grant was on the back of what Jose Mourinho built, and Pellegrini was on the back of what Roberto Mancini built before him. So the first season with West Ham United, another moderate finish of 10th after spending over £100 million in the transfer market. But the second season was absolutely disastrous. So 5 managers on, 3 of which were foreign managers and 2 of which were domestic managers, West Ham again find themselves in a situation where they've got to decide which direction of manager they want to go in. Of these 5 managers, they all have one thing in common. They have Premier League experience. Bilic as a player and the other 4 managers in actually managing other clubs in the Premier League. So it's reasonable to assume that Sullivan is going to be looking for something similar to what he already has had in the past. He's going to look for a safe pair of hands. He's going to look for a manager that's got experience, ideally in the Premier League. And he's going to look for a manager that he thinks might take West Ham to the next level. And that kind of manager is not necessarily the kind of manager that Tim Steidten will necessarily want at the club. Steidten will go out there, will look for a young manager, different kind of qualities, different kind of tactics, different kind of techniques. If he comes from a foreign, from Europe or wherever, it won't matter to Steidten. And because of that, there could be potential conflict between the 2 men as to what kind of manager we want to bring in to take West Ham United forward. There's a clear indication that Sullivan will also favour a manager that's likely to be here for the long term rather than the short term. You see that ironically, of all the managers that Sullivan has recruited at West Ham, the 2 domestic managers, both Allardyce and Moyes, have had the longest tenures at West Ham United, whereas all the other managers have had some of them not even more than 2 seasons before they've gone. As I've said, Sullivan also wants a steady pair of hands who will be here for the long term. So that kind of already excludes the likes of Ruben Amorim. So it'll be no surprise to me at all if David Moyes does leave. We will find ourselves with a manager of very similar traits to him. And for me, there really is only one manager at the end of the day that kind of fits the bill that both Sullivan and Steidten would both be happy with. Unfortunately, however, he's still in a job. And if for any reason Newcastle decide that they want to part ways with their current manager, I think Eddie Howe would be top priority for both Sullivan and Steidten. He'd be the one manager that I guess both men would both agree with. Still young, knowledge of the Premier League, good experience. He's managed a couple of teams, and doing reasonably well at Newcastle. But Newcastle might be thinking that perhaps Eddie Howe, oh, by the way, also someone that stays with the club for the long term. So I think perhaps if Newcastle are beginning to think that they need a bigger, high profile manager than Eddie Howe, and if Eddie Howe became available this summer, for me, he would be the ideal fit for West Ham United.